Ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge strong support for H.R. 390, the Bipartisan Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act. I want to begin by offering my special thanks to Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy for his strong and sustained support for the victims of genocide for this bill, and for the work of his amazing staff, especially Luke Murray, who has done yeoman's work on making sure that this moves forward. I want to thank Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his Chief of Staff, Sharon Soderstrom, for their work, as well as our friends on the Senate side. Especially, I want to thank Ed Royce, our Chairman, and Ranking Member Elliot Engel, again, for their wonderful support for this bill, and for all the members. And I do want to thank Anna Eshoo, who has been tenacious in her support for genocide-targeted communities in Iraq and Syria, and Matt McMurray, her Chief of Staff, who has also been a friend to work on this legislation. My thanks to Mary Noonan, my Chief of Staff, Piero Tozzi, who's our Staff Director for the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, Nathaniel Hurd at the U.S. Helsinki Commission, who has been the lead staffer on the bill, and David Trimble, Senior Fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute, and so many others who have been a part of this effort to get this across the finish line. Mr. Speaker, in September of 2013, I chaired my first of 10 congressional hearings focused in whole or in part on Christians, Yazidis, and other religious and ethnic minorities targeted by ISIS for genocide and other atrocity crimes. Frustrated and deeply disappointed that the previous administration was failing to direct aid to these survivors and to support criminal investigations into the perpetrators, 3 years later, on September 8th of 2016, I introduced H.R. 5961. It was clear then, as it is now, that local, overstretched, underfunded groups on the ground were being forced to fill a huge gap, like the Chaldean Catholic Archdiocese of Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, supported by the Knights of Columbus under the extraordinary leadership of Carl Anderson, and by Aid to the Church in Need. To date, the Knights of Columbus have contributed $20 million. The Aid to the Church in Need has contributed more than $60 million to the response for these people who are the survivors of genocide. Without this support from private charity, Mr. Speaker, many people, especially children, would have died or have been afflicted with serious disease or disability. Where was the United States? Nowhere to be found. Just before Christmas of 2016, I led a delegation to Erbil at the invitation of the Chaldean Archbishop of Erbil, Bashar Warda, who was heroically leading the effort to sustain more than 70,000 Christians who had fled ISIS, as well as some Yazidis, as well as some of the Muslims. There I met with genocide survivors, almost all of whom told me that they had family members who were murdered, tortured, beaten, and raped by ISIS. Their stories were tragic beyond words, heartbreaking beyond words. But members of my delegation and I were in awe of their deep and abiding faith in God, their resiliency, and their courage. They simply would not quit. They would move on and try to live a life and try to thrive. We visited a camp of 6,000 internally displaced persons managed by the Archdiocese. The U.S. government had not even visited until just before our trip in 2016, even though it was only 10 minutes away from the consulate. I was told I shouldn't go, that it was too dangerous. And I said, well, was there a specific threat? And there wasn't. When we got there, we were met by about 250 to 300 children, all about 4th, 5th graders, thereabouts, singing Christmas carols. And I felt, boy, that's a real threatening situation. It was foolish in the extreme. And they needed our help. They were not getting enough food. They were not getting enough medicine. And their shelter was very meager, to say the least. So in January of 2017, I introduced H.R. 390, a stronger version of the previous bill. The House unanimously passed it, again, totally bipartisan, on June 6th. On October 11th, the Senate passed it with a slightly amended version, which is why it's here before the House today for reconsideration. H.R. 390 authorizes the Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Secretary of State to direct humanitarian, stabilization and recovery assistance to these communities to enable them to survive and someday thrive in Iraq and Syria. It also authorizes the Secretary and the Administrator to fund entities conducting criminal investigations into ISIS perpetrators who committed atrocity crimes in Iraq. The evidence these entities collect and preserve will be used to apprehend, prosecute, and convict perpetrators in a range of court settings. We've learned from the courts in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, as well as the court in Yugoslavia. You've got to capture this information. You have to get the testimonies from survivors and eyewitnesses to effectuate effective prosecutions. The surviving religious and ethnic communities have begun to receive some targeted aid from the United States under the leadership of Vice President Pence, USAID Administrator Green, and Secretary Pompeo. The governments of Hungary and Poland as well have stepped up to provide assistance to those in need. However, we've got to move quickly on this bill and on implementation of it. As Archbishop Warda, again the head of the Chaldean church there, told me today, and I quote him, "Christians in Iraq are still at the brink of extinction. H.R. 390 is vital to our survival. If it becomes law, implementation must be full and fast. Otherwise, the help it provides will be too late for us." I reserve the balance of our time.